On Friday, Ukraine scored a major victory when its forces liberated the city of Kherson. After 8 months under Russian rule, residents greeted soldiers with flowers and hugs. Kherson was the first major Ukrainian city and only regional capital that had fallen to Russia since the start of the invasion. Putin declared it Russian territory only 5 weeks ago. He did that illegally, we should note. So what does Ukraine's success there mean for the larger war? My next guest is Dara Masako, a senior policy researcher at the RAND Corporation. Dara, thank you so much for joining us. So I know you probably, like me, were watching these images just in amazement yesterday to see that city liberated and to see all of the residents there coming out and thanking soldiers. But from a strategic standpoint, how significant is it that Kherson is back in Ukrainian hands?
It is significant from a morale perspective for the Ukrainian armed forces. The writing has been on the wall for that Russian group of forces on the west bank of the river since about July or August. It was an untenable position for them to hold. The Ukrainians had attacked multiple bridges for them to get supplies in and out. So in some ways, Russia had two terrible choices before it: stay and be encircled, captured, which would have been a catastrophe, or the embarrassing political decision to have a controlled retreat.
Talk about the importance of Kherson's location, specifically where it is located close to Crimea, for both Russians and Ukrainians.
Well, there's two issues at play now that Russia has evacuated from that area. It basically signals the end of their ambitions to control most of Ukraine's coast in the Black Sea. And secondly, now what Russia's preparing to do is create defensive positions, trenches on the eastern side of the river to defend itself in Crimea from HIMARS attacks or continued Ukrainian advancement. Crimea is really a concern now, I would think.
How significant is what this retreat looked like and how Russia conducted it? Because if you compare it to what we saw earlier, I believe that was in September, after that surprise counteroffensive in the northeast by the Ukrainians, where we saw the Russians retreat from Liman, they lost a lot of their military equipment, not to mention their ammunition and their soldiers at that. What are you seeing here?
I'm seeing two different things. So with that, up in Kharkiv, that would be accurately described as a rout. Ukrainian forces pressed on Russian units that were under strength, not particularly highest readiness units. And when they encountered Ukrainians in combat situations, they simply fled. It was a panicked retreat. They abandoned equipment, munitions. It was really quite in a panic sort of egress situation. I would contrast that to what's going on, or what just recently concluded in Kharkiv. That was something that was controlled. Units were falling back into pre-prepared positions. They were doing it slowly over time. I think it's been in process for about 3 or 4 weeks at minimum. So it is a retreat, but you didn't see these large-scale battles. You didn't see a massive loss of Russian soldiers. It really was not a panicked withdrawal. It was hasty, but not panicked.
How big of a loss was this for Vladimir Putin? As you mentioned, that this retreat had been planned for a few weeks. So for those who've been closely watching, while it was good news, it was not necessarily surprising news. Vladimir Putin had been hesitant to finally green light it, and yet he did. What does this mean for him?
I think it was so embarrassing for him that he couldn't put a public face on this. He had his defense minister and the commander of his forces in Ukraine, General Sergei Surovikin, come out and discuss the reasons why and really be the public face to that. It tells me that he is trying to insulate himself from bad news and potentially pin this on his defense minister.
And the mass atrocities just that we are uncovering throughout the country, I would imagine would be expected here. You heard President Zelensky say that the Russians had attacked most of their infrastructure, their water supply, their energy, their electricity. Is this something you fear we'll see more of, especially as we're approaching the colder winter months?
I do, and unfortunately there's part of this in Russian military strategy. When you attack critical infrastructure, you really start dismantling what they call life support systems for these big cities: water, sewage, electricity, to really make life unbearable, try to create a refugee type of a situation, and really just slow the machinery of the government down. Unfortunately, I do see this trend line continuing.
And quickly, last question. Do you think that this success for Ukraine will at least buy them some time in the increased concern that we've heard from them about what the influx of materials and weaponry and funding will look like from the West?
I do. It's to Ukraine's incentive to keep going as long as they can. The Russians have every incentive for this conflict line to freeze so they can improve their positions, deploy several thousand, 300,000 mobilized forces into Ukraine.
Yeah.
So for Ukraine, they want to keep going. As long as they have the means and material to do so, I believe they will.
Yeah, we're expecting those forces to be mobilized at any time by the Russians. Thank you so much, Dara Masico. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Former Vice President Mike Pence joins Jake Tapper for a live CNN town hall Wednesday at 9 Eastern. Don't miss that. And next on GPS, after Benjamin Netanyahu was asked today to form Israel's next government, many eyes around the world will be watching closely to see just how much power far right-wing elements in his coalition are given. We'll be back in just a moment.